The thing about humiliation is that it doesn't always announce itself with a slap or a shout. Sometimes it arrives on a plate, wrapped in politeness, served with a smile that never quite reaches the eyes. Sometimes it's just a piece of bread, dry and crumbling at the edges, placed in front of you while everyone else gets the feast. And sometimes, when you've spent your whole life being the one who documents everything, you finally realize that the camera doesn't just capture moments. It exposes them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the exact moment I understood what joy looked like on my mother's face. Not the polite smile she wore for church photos or the tired grin she managed after double shifts at the office. Real joy, the kind that makes a person look 10 years younger and completely unguarded. It was the summer of 1993, and our family had scraped together enough money for a day trip to Cedar Point. I was 7 years old, and my sister Mandy was barely walking, still toddling around in those puffy diapers that made her look like a little duck. Dad had won some kind of raffle at work, nothing huge, just enough for tickets and gas money. Mom packed sandwiches in a blue cooler that had seen better days, the kind with a cracked lid that never quite sealed right. We drove 2 hours in our station wagon with the windows down, because the air conditioning had given up the ghost sometime around 1989. Mandy cried for the first hour, and I entertained her by making shadow puppets against the back of Dad's headrest. When we got there, Mom bought herself a funnel cake. Just one, which she shared with all of us, breaking off pieces with her fingers and handing them out like communion wafers. But I watched her take the first bite, and for just a second she closed her eyes. Powdered sugar dusted her nose, and when Dad laughed and brushed it off with his thumb, she actually giggled. Not the exhausted chuckle I was used to hearing, but a real bright sound that seemed to surprise even her. I took a mental snapshot of that moment, the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she leaned into Dad's side while Mandy tugged on her shorts and demanded to see the horses on the carousel. Years later, when I decided to become a documentary filmmaker, I traced it back to that day. I wanted to capture those moments, the ones where people forgot to perform and just existed in their own happiness. My name is Natalie Cooper. I'm 38 years old, and I make my living telling other people's stories. I started out doing wedding videos in college, moved on to corporate training films to pay the bills, and eventually carved out a niche creating mini-documentaries for nonprofits and small businesses. Nothing that's going to win awards at Sundance, but honest work that lets me live in a decent loft in Portland and own camera equipment that costs more than my first car. I'm single, no kids, though my mother brings up both facts with the regularity of a church bell every time we talk on the phone. I've been called obsessive, detail-oriented, and occasionally too intense for casual conversation. I'm the person who notices when the lighting is off in a restaurant, who can't watch a movie without analyzing the editing choices, who keeps backup drives of backup drives because I've learned the hard way that nothing is permanent unless you fight to preserve it. Mandy, my younger sister, took a different path. She's a real estate agent in Worthington, one of those upscale suburbs outside Columbus where every house looks like it was designed by the same architect who only knows how to draw columns in 3-car garages. She's good at her job, the kind of good that comes from knowing exactly what people want to hear and how to make them feel like they're getting a deal even when they're overpaying. She married Derek 3 years ago in a wedding that had more flower arrangements than guests, and they bought a house with a kitchen island so large you could land a small aircraft on it. My parents, Bob and Patty, still live in Mapleton, the town where Mandy and I grew up. Dad retired from the Postal Service 2 years ago, and spends most of his time now working on a model train set in the basement that has expanded to cover roughly a quarter of the available floor space. Mom works part-time at the church office, answering phones and organizing the prayer chain, which mostly means she knows everyone's business before they do. I hadn't been home much in the past 2 years. Portland is a comfortable distance from Ohio, close enough to fly for emergencies but far enough that surprise visits aren't really an option. I sent birthday cards, made the obligatory phone calls, and showed up for Christmas every other year. The last time I'd been back was for Mandy's wedding, where I'd been assigned to the table with the extended family members nobody quite knew what to do with, seated between a second cousin who sold essential oils and Uncle Stephen, who spent the entire reception explaining his theory about how the moon landing was filmed in Nevada. I told myself the distance was about work, about building my career in a city that actually had opportunities for what I did. But the truth, the one I didn't like examining too closely, was simpler. Being around my family felt like wearing shoes that used to fit but had somehow shrunk over the years. Every conversation seemed to pinch in places I couldn't quite identify, and every visit left me with a vague sense of exhaustion that had nothing to do with jet lag. Still, when Mom called in early November and said they were planning a big Thanksgiving dinner, I felt that old pull of obligation mixed with something that might have been hope. She used her special voice, the one that was light and casual but had an undercurrent of expectation running through it like a riptide. "We'd love to have you home this year, sweetie. Mandy and Derek are coming, and we're inviting Aunt Carol and Uncle Stephen, plus the cousins. Even Grandma Dottie is making the trip down from Cleveland. It's been so long since we've all been together." I should have heard the warning in that statement. When my mother starts talking about everyone being together, it usually means she's orchestrating something, arranging people like furniture until the room looks the way she wants it to. But I was in the middle of editing a project that had run over deadline, surviving on coffee and the kind of takeout that comes in containers designed to make you feel both efficient and vaguely ashamed. The idea of a home-cooked meal and a few days away from my apartment sounded almost appealing. "I'll be there," I said. "Do you want me to bring anything?" "Just yourself, honey. Mandy's handling most of the cooking this year. She's been taking classes, you know. Got herself a new Dutch oven and everything. She's so excited to show everyone what she's learned." Something in my chest tightened, but I ignored it. Of course Mandy was cooking. Of course she'd found another way to be the center of attention. Another skill to add to her collection of things that made her seem more capable, more adult, more settled than her older sister who still ate cereal for dinner twice a week. "That sounds great," I said, and I almost meant it. The flight from Portland to Columbus was uneventful in the way that makes you forget it the moment you land. I picked up my rental car, a compact thing that smelled like synthetic air freshener and someone else's French fries, and made the 40-minute drive to Mapleton as the November afternoon faded into that particular gray that only Midwestern autumns can achieve. The trees were mostly bare, their branches black against a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or just threatened to. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it always had. A 2-story colonial with cream-colored siding and dark green shutters that Dad repainted every 3 years like clockwork. The driveway was already crowded with cars, which surprised me. I thought I was arriving early, had specifically timed my flight to give me a few hours to settle in before the chaos of Thanksgiving Day itself. I parked on the street and hauled my bag up the front walk, noticing that someone had planted new mums in the flower beds, their burnt orange and deep yellow blooms the only real color in the landscape. Before I could reach for the doorbell, the door swung open, and my mother appeared, already talking. "Oh good, you made it. Come in, come in. We're just in the middle of preparations. Mandy's been here since this morning getting everything organized. She's so good at this sort of thing, you know. Really found her calling with entertaining." I stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. Garlic and butter and something sweet and yeasty that made my stomach remember it hadn't eaten since the airport bagel at 5 in the morning. The house hummed with activity, voices layering over each other from deeper inside. The clatter of dishes, the hum of what sounded like a stand mixer. Mom took my coat before I... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I could protest and hung it in the hall closet, which was already bursting with jackets and scarves. I noticed a new photo on the wall, a professional portrait of Mandy and Derek posed in what looked like an apple orchard, both of them wearing coordinated sweaters and smiling with all their teeth showing. The frame was expensive, the matting perfectly cut. Below it, older family photos looked faded and slightly crooked by comparison. "Everyone's here already?" I asked. "Oh well, Mandy invited a few people for a pre-Thanksgiving gathering tonight. Just close family and some friends. Very casual. She thought it would be nice to spread the celebration out a bit, you know, so tomorrow isn't so overwhelming." I followed Mom toward the kitchen, my suitcase wheels catching on the transition between the hallway runner and the hardwood floor. As we approached, the voices grew louder, and I could make out distinct conversations now. Aunt Carol's distinctive laugh, Uncle Stephen holding forth about something in that professor tone he used even though he'd never actually been a professor, the higher pitches of my cousins comparing notes about something. The kitchen had been transformed. Not physically, it was still the same space with the oak cabinets Dad had installed in 2003, and the countertops that showed every crumb. But it had been dressed up, made to look like something from a cooking show. Platters lined every available surface, artfully arranged with cheeses and crackers and grapes cut into perfect clusters. Wine bottles stood open on the counter, breathing or aerating or whatever it was wine was supposed to do. Someone had tied a rustic burlap ribbon around a vase of wheat stalks. And there, in the center of it all, wearing an apron that said whisk-taker in scrolling letters, was Mandy. She looked up when I entered, and her face did something complicated. A smile that started genuine and then remembered to be bigger, brighter, more performative. She had flour on her cheek, strategically placed, I thought, like she'd seen someone do it in a movie and understood that it signaled charming domestic chaos rather than actual mess. Natalie, you're here. She came around the island, arms outstretched, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like vanilla and expensive shampoo. I'm so glad you could make it. I know how busy you always are. The emphasis on always was slight, barely there, but I'd grown up with Mandy. I knew how to hear the things she didn't quite say out loud. I wouldn't miss it, I replied, pulling back and taking in the scene. This is quite a setup. Mom said you were cooking. Oh, just experimenting with a few recipes. Derek and I took this amazing French cooking course last month. The instructor trained at Le Cordon Bleu. I've been dying to try out some techniques on a larger group. Derek appeared from the dining room, carrying a stack of plates. He nodded at me, his version of a greeting. Derek wasn't unfriendly exactly, just perpetually distracted, like he was always mentally calculating his commission on an invisible car sale. Over the next hour, the house filled up completely. Grandma Dottie arrived with her oversized purse that clinked when she set it down, which meant she brought her own supply of peppermint schnapps because she didn't trust anyone else's liquor choices. The cousins, Tyler, Jessica, and Brandon, clustered in the family room, absorbed in their phones. The Hendersons and the Martins, family friends I vaguely remembered from childhood barbecues, came bearing wine and store-bought pies that Mandy accepted with gracious smiles while immediately relocating them to a less visible spot on the counter. I found myself drifting through the rooms, not quite part of any conversation but not excluded either. I was there, present, accounted for. I helped set out napkins when Mom asked. I refreshed drinks. I laughed at Uncle Steven's jokes about airline food, even though nobody had flown anywhere recently and airline food hadn't been a thing worth joking about for at least a decade. Dinner was called at 7. The formal dining room table, the one we only used for major holidays, had been extended to its full length and set with Mom's good china, the pattern with the tiny blue flowers that had been a wedding gift from some aunt I'd never met. Candles flickered in silver holders. A centerpiece of gourds and more wheat stalks anchored the middle of the table. People found their seats in that organic chaos that happens with large gatherings, pulling out chairs and shuffling positions until couples were together and older relatives had easier access to exits. I waited, letting everyone else settle first, and realized with a strange detachment that no place card had my name on it. Mandy emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter, Derek behind her with another. She'd changed into a different top, something cream-colored and elegant that somehow had remained spotless despite hours of cooking. Everyone sit. We're doing this family style so people can serve themselves. The platters came out one after another. A golden brown turkey that glistened under the chandelier light. Mashed potatoes whipped to perfect peaks and dotted with butter. Green beans that had been sautéed with almonds and looked like they belonged in a magazine. Cranberry sauce made from scratch and still in the shape of the bowl it had been molded in. Rolls that steamed when people broke them open, revealing soft, pillowy interiors. I watched it all appear, course after course, and finally spotted an empty chair at the far end of the table, partially blocked by the doorway to the kitchen. I slid into it, and someone passed me a plate. The conversation flowed around me, people praising Mandy's cooking, asking her about recipes, commenting on how professional everything looked. Derek beamed beside her, interjecting occasionally with details about the cooking class or the special pan they'd bought for the turkey. Mom and Dad looked pleased, proud, like they were watching a performance they'd secretly hoped would turn out exactly this way. I served myself from the dishes that made it down to my end of the table. The turkey platter, when it arrived, had only the dried-out edge pieces left. The potatoes had been mostly scraped clean. I took what was there and didn't comment. Then I noticed the bread basket being passed around. Warm rolls for everyone else, the kind that left butter melting in golden pools. But when it reached me, there was only one item left, a piece of plain bread, the kind that comes pre-sliced from the store, No butter, no warmth, just dry and slightly stale at the corners. I stared at it for a moment, this final piece of evidence of something I'd been trying not to name. Then I picked it up, tore off a small piece and put it in my mouth. It had the texture of cardboard and tasted like absolutely nothing at all. Across the table, Mandy was laughing at something Aunt Carol had said, her hand resting on Derek's arm, her face glowing in the candlelight. She looked happy, genuinely happy, in a way that reminded me of Mom eating that funnel cake all those years ago. Except this time I wasn't included in the moment. I was just there to witness it, to fill a chair, to make the head count come out right. I finished my dry bread in silence while 60 people, or maybe it just felt like 60, continued their celebration around me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, where I keep my cameras and my editing software and my instinct for knowing when a moment means something bigger than itself, I felt something click into place. Not anger exactly, not yet. Just a quiet understanding that some moments don't just deserve to be captured. They deserve to be shown. Part 2. The hidden dream. I didn't sleep well that night. The guest room, my old bedroom before Mandy claimed it when I left for college and Mom redecorated it into something neutral and impersonal, felt smaller than I remembered. The bed was comfortable enough, but I kept waking up at odd hours, my mind replaying the dinner in fragments. The sound of silverware against china. The way conversation seemed to flow everywhere except toward my end of the table. That piece of bread sitting alone in the basket. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and pulled out my laptop. The blue light felt harsh in the darkness, but I needed something to occupy my hands, my thoughts. I opened my editing software out of habit, the interface as familiar to me as my own reflection. Timelines and tracks and layers, the architecture of how moments become stories. I started scrolling through old project files, things I'd archived years ago. A documentary about a community garden in Northeast Portland. A profile piece on a woodworker who made furniture from reclaimed barn wood. A short film about a woman who'd started a free library in her front yard after her daughter died. Each one a small story about people creating something meaningful, building tiny monuments to the things they cared about. Then I found a folder I'd forgotten existed, labeled simply Family Footage, 1999 to 2010. I must have created it during one of those phases where I'd convinced myself I was going to edit together some kind of Cooper family highlight reel, a gift for my parents' anniversary or Christmas or some occasion that never quite materialized. I clicked it open and started playing files at random. There I was at 14 holding a camcorder I'd gotten for my birthday, filming Dad as he attempted to assemble a grill in the backyard. His commentary was a string of mild profanity and muttered complaints about instructions that had clearly been translated from 3 other languages before arriving in English. Mom appeared in the frame briefly, bringing him a glass of lemonade and kissing the top of his head. He swatted at her playfully and she laughed. Another clip showed Mandy at maybe 7 or 8, performing an elaborate dance routine she'd choreographed to a Britney Spears song. She'd forced me to film it, had insisted on multiple takes until she got the moves exactly right. I remember being annoyed at the time, wanting to film literally anything else. But watching it now, I could see how seriously she'd taken it, how much she'd needed someone to witness her effort. There were dozens of these moments. Birthday parties where I was always behind the camera, never in front of it. School concerts where I documented Mandy's performances but skipped my own to make sure I got the angles right. Family dinners where I'd set up the tripod to capture everyone together, then eaten my own meal after the recording stopped, alone in the kitchen while the food went cold. A pattern I hadn't wanted to acknowledge started becoming impossible to ignore. In every clip, every frame, every moment I'd carefully preserved, I was the one documenting, the one making sure the memory existed in permanent form. But I was rarely in the memory itself. I was the recorder, not the recorded. The witness, not the participant. I found myself thinking about a project I'd pitched 3 years ago. A documentary about invisible labor in families. The working title had been Unseen, and the premise was simple. Interview people who did the necessary work that held households together but rarely received recognition for it. The person who always remembered everyone's birthdays. The sibling who coordinated holiday schedules. The daughter who became the de facto family therapist, absorbing everyone's problems without expecting reciprocation. The project never got funded. The grant committee said it was too niche, too personal, not broad enough in its appeal. But sitting there in the dark at 3 in the morning, Watching my younger self film everyone else's lives, I realized I'd been trying to tell my own story without admitting that's what it was. I'd spent 20 years creating a record of my family, preserving their moments, making sure their joy and celebrations and milestones existed beyond memory. I'd done it because I loved them, yes, but also because part of me believed that if I documented them well enough, thoroughly enough, maybe I'd secure my place in the narrative. Maybe I'd become essential by making myself useful. The dinner replayed itself in my mind with new clarity. The seat at the end of the table wasn't random. The dry bread wasn't an accident. These weren't oversights or coincidences. They were the physical manifestation of something that had always been true but never spoken. I was valuable for what I provided, not for who I was. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed. A branch scraped against the window with a sound like fingernails on glass. Somewhere down the hall, someone, probably Dad, was snoring in a rhythmic pattern that might have been soothing if I weren't so completely awake. When morning finally came, gray light filtering through curtains that didn't quite close all the way, I heard movement in the kitchen below. The coffee maker gurgling, cabinet doors opening and closing, the muted sound of the television playing the local news at low volume. I got dressed slowly, pulling on jeans and a sweater, and made my way downstairs. Mom was alone in the kitchen, still in her bathrobe, hair pulled back with a clip. She looked up when I entered and smiled, the automatic expression of someone who'd spent decades greeting children at breakfast. "You're up early. Want some coffee? Please." She poured me a cup in one of the mismatched mugs from the cabinet, this one advertising a 10K race from 2008. I wrapped my hands around it, grateful for the warmth. "Big day today," she said, moving to the refrigerator and surveying its contents. "Mandy's coming over at 10 to start on the turkey. She's got this whole plan, a brine she mixed yesterday, and Derek's bringing over some special roasting pan they bought. It's going to be quite a production." "Sounds like it." Mom glanced at me, something flickering across her face that might have been concern or might have been annoyance at my tone. She decided on concern. "You seemed quiet last night at dinner. Everything okay?" I took a sip of coffee, buying myself a moment. "Everything's fine. Just tired from the flight." She accepted this easily, visibly relieved to not pursue anything deeper. "Well, try to perk up today. It's Thanksgiving. Family time." "Right. Family time." She moved on to discussing the plan for the day, who was arriving when, what dishes still needed to be prepared, whether we had enough ice. I listened and made appropriate noises, but my mind was elsewhere, still stuck on those old video files, on the pattern they revealed. Around 9:30, I went back upstairs and retrieved my camera bag from the closet where I'd stored it. It was my good equipment, the gear I use for professional shoots. A Canon mirrorless with 3 lenses, a shotgun mic, extra batteries, memory cards with enough capacity to film for hours. I brought it thinking maybe I'd capture some family moments, a few clips from my archives. Now I had a different purpose forming. Still vague but growing more solid with each passing minute. I spent some time checking settings, making sure everything was charged and ready. Then I attached my smallest lens, the Pancake 40mm that made the camera less conspicuous, and slipped it into a canvas bag that didn't scream professional videographer. Mandy arrived promptly at 10, Derek in tow carrying a cooler that presumably held the brine turkey. She dressed for the occasion in dark jeans and a cream-colored cable knit sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that managed to look both casual and carefully constructed. She breezed past me in the hallway with a smile that felt more like a reflex than genuine acknowledgement. The house filled up gradually over the next few hours. Grandma Dottie appeared first, earlier than expected, explaining that she'd left Cleveland before dawn because she didn't trust holiday traffic. Uncle Stephen and Aunt Carol came next, followed by the cousins in a separate car, all of them looking vaguely hungover. The Hendersons and the Martins arrived together, apparently having coordinated carpools. I moved through the gathering with my camera, keeping it mostly at my side but occasionally raising it to capture moments. Nobody questioned it. This was my known role, the family documentarian, the one who made sure events were preserved. If anything, people seemed to expect it, posing slightly when they noticed the lens pointing their direction, making sure their best angles were available. What they didn't know was that I'd set the camera to record continuously, even when it was hanging at my side or resting on a bookshelf. The microphone picked up conversations from across rooms. The wide-angle lens captured more context than people realized. I wasn't just documenting the celebration. I was gathering evidence. Mandy held court in the kitchen, orchestrating the meal preparation like a conductor leading an orchestra. She created a detailed timeline, courses and temperatures and resting periods all calculated to the minute. Mom assisted, following instructions with the deference usually reserved for professional chefs. Derek hovered nearby, his primary job seeming to be opening wine bottles and agreeing with everything Mandy said. Around noon, I wandered into the kitchen under the pretense of refilling my water glass. Mandy was basting the turkey, her face flushed from the oven's heat, a few strands of hair escaping her ponytail in a way that somehow made her look more appealing rather than disheveled. "Smells amazing," I offered. "Thanks. I'm trying this new technique where you start at high heat and then drop the temperature. Supposed to make the skin crispier while keeping the meat moist. Sounds complicated." She shrugged, closing the oven door and setting a timer on her phone. "It's not that hard once you understand the science. That's what the cooking class really taught us, the why behind the techniques, not just the how." Mom appeared with empty serving dishes, placing them on the counter near the stove. "Mandy, honey, what time should we plan to eat?" "I'm thinking around 3. That gives the turkey time to rest properly. You can't rush a good bird." "Perfect. That gives everyone time to socialize." Mom left to relay this information to the gathering in the living room. Mandy turned back to her prep work, and I seized the small window of opportunity. "Last night was nice," I said carefully. "You put together a great meal." "Oh, thanks. I was worried the timing would be off, but everything came together." "Big crowd." "Yeah, it got bigger than I initially planned. You know how it is, you invite a few people and then it snowballs. Everyone wants to be part of it." I nodded slowly. "Must have taken a lot of planning." "It did. I started organizing it back in September, actually. Wanted to make sure we could get everyone together before the actual holiday got too crazy." September. 3 months of planning for an event I'd learned about less than a week ago, and only because Mom had mentioned it in passing. 3 months of coordination and invitations and menu planning, all happening without anyone thinking to include me in any stage of the process. "Well, you're really good at this," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "The hosting thing. Making people feel welcome." She looked up from the herb she was chopping, and for just a second, something complicated passed across her face. "Thanks, Nat. That means a lot coming from you." The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. It sounded genuine, free of the performative warmth she usually deployed. For a moment I saw my little sister again, the one who used to follow me around the house begging me to play, who cried when I left for college because she didn't want me to go. Then Derek walked in asking where they'd put the good corkscrew, and the moment dissolved. Mandy returned to her preparations, and I slipped out of the kitchen, camera bag secure over my shoulder. I spent the afternoon documenting everything with methodical precision. The living room where Dad and Uncle Stephen had fallen into their traditional argument about Ohio State football. The dining room as it was set up, place settings arranged with care, everyone's name carefully written on small cards in Mandy's neat handwriting. Everyone except mine, I noticed. My spot at the end had no card, no designation, just an empty plate and silverware that didn't quite match the rest of the set. I filmed Grandma Dottie in the corner chair, sipping her schnapps-enhanced coffee and holding court with stories about Thanksgivings past, when she'd cooked for 20 people in a kitchen half this size with none of these modern conveniences. I captured the cousins in the family room, absorbed in some multiplayer game on their phones, barely interacting in person despite being seated inches apart. Around 2:30, Mandy called everyone to the table. The migration happened in stages, people finishing conversations and refilling drinks before making their way to the dining room. I hung back, letting everyone else find their seats first, watching the choreography of family dynamics play out. The best seats, the ones closest to where the turkey would be placed, went to Mandy and Derek, flanked by my parents. Grandma Dottie got the chair at the head of the table, a position of honor. Aunt Carol and Uncle Stephen sat together on one side. The cousins clustered at the opposite end from where I'd sat the night before. The Hendersons and the Martins filled in the remaining middle seats. I ended up in the same spot as last night, partially hidden by the doorway, the chair that let you see everything but kept you slightly separated from the main action. This time I positioned my camera on the windowsill behind me, angled to capture the full length of the table. The red recording light was small enough that nobody would notice unless they were looking for it. Mandy and Derek made several trips from the kitchen, bringing out platters and bowls that exceeded even last night's spread. The turkey, golden and massive, took center stage. Side dishes radiated outward. Sweet potatoes topped with toasted marshmallows, Brussels sprouts with bacon, stuffing that steamed when the spoon broke through the crispy top, green bean casserole with those crunchy onions on top that come from a can but somehow taste essential. The serving process began, dishes passed hand to hand, everyone taking generous portions. Compliments flowed toward Mandy, who accepted them with practiced humility that somehow still managed to highlight her effort. Derek poured wine for the adults, sparkling cider for the younger cousins. Mom led a brief prayer, thanking God for family and abundance in safe travels. Then the eating began, punctuated by conversation and laughter, and the particular sounds of a successful holiday meal. Forks scraped against china. Wine glasses clinked in informal toasts. Someone told a joke I couldn't quite hear from my end of the table, and half the room erupted in laughter. I served myself from what reached me, which was less than everyone else received but more than last night. The turkey platter came with actual meat still on it, though the pieces were smaller, darker, clearly from parts of the bird that weren't prime real estate. The side dishes had been depleted but not emptied. I could make a decent plate and I did. What I noticed, what my camera was capturing in steady, unflinching footage, was the pattern of attention. Conversations orbited around Mandy's end of the table. Questions about recipes were directed to her. Compliments about the food, about the presentation, about what a wonderful job she'd done, all flowed in her direction. Derek basked in reflected glory, interjecting occasionally with details about their cooking class or the special ingredients they'd sourced. My parents looked happier than I'd seen them in years. Dad kept reaching over to squeeze Mom's hand. Mom's face had that soft quality I remembered from Cedar Point, the one that meant she felt safe and content and surrounded by exactly the life she wanted. And me? I was there, physically present, consuming the food, occupying space. But conversationally, emotionally, I might as well have been in Portland. Nobody asked about my work or my life or what I'd been up to. The few comments directed my way were surface-level pleasantries, the verbal equivalent of patting someone's head as you walk past. About halfway through the meal, Aunt Carol turned to Mandy and said, "You know, you really should start a catering business or a blog or something. This is restaurant-quality food." "Oh, I've thought about it," Mandy replied, her voice carrying that particular tone of false modesty that meant she'd thought about it extensively. "But I don't know if I have the time with work and everything." "You'd be amazing at it," Mom added. "You have such a gift for making people feel special." "It runs in the family," Grandma Dottie interjected. "Your grandmother on your father's side, my mother-in-law, she could put together a meal for 30 people without breaking a sweat. Mandy gets it from her." I took another bite of turkey, which was admittedly perfectly cooked, moist and flavorful. I chewed slowly, thinking about the irony of someone inheriting a gift from a person they'd never met while the person who'd actually raised them, who'd taught them how to crack eggs and measure flour, sat at the same table without acknowledgement. The meal continued. Plates were cleared. Dessert appeared. Multiple pies and a chocolate cake that Mandy admitted she'd outsourced to a local bakery, because even she had limits. Coffee was served. The conversation shifted to plans for Christmas, speculation about weather, someone's upcoming vacation to Florida. I excused myself quietly, retrieving my camera from the windowsill and slipping out of the dining room. Nobody noticed my departure, or, if they did, nobody commented on it. I went upstairs to the guest room and transferred the footage to my laptop, watching the battery icon climb as files copied over. While I waited, I scrolled through my phone, looking at nothing in particular, just needing something to do with my hands. A notification popped up, a text from a friend back in Portland asking how the holiday was going. I started to type a response, then deleted it, then started again, then deleted it again. What was there to say that didn't sound either whiny or melodramatic? Instead, I opened my email and found a message from a client, someone who'd hired me last year to create a documentary about their nonprofit's work with homeless youth. They were asking if I'd be interested in a follow-up project, something longer and more ambitious. The budget they mentioned was substantial, enough to cover several months of work and still have room left over. I reread the email 3 times, and somewhere around the second time through, an idea began forming. Not fully developed yet, just the kernel of something, but it felt important. What if I took that budget, that time, that creative freedom they were offering, and used it to tell a different story? What if I finally finished that project about invisible labor, about the people who hold families together without recognition? And what if I started with the clearest example I knew myself? The footage finished transferring. I disconnected the camera and queued up the files, watching through them on fast forward, looking for specific moments. The dinner table in full. The serving process. The distribution of attention. The empty seat at the end where I'd sat, visible in frame but separate from the main action. It was all there, documented in high definition with clean audio. Evidence of a pattern I'd lived my entire life but never quite seen from the outside. The camera didn't lie, didn't soften edges or rationalize behavior. It simply showed what was. Downstairs, I could hear the party continuing. Someone had turned on music, something instrumental and jazzy that suggested the meal had transitioned into the mingling phase. Voices rose and fell in waves of conversation. Occasional laughter punctuated the general hum. I should go back down, I thought. I should rejoin them, make an appearance, fulfill my role as attendee even if not as participant. But instead I stayed where I was, laptop open, footage queued, and started doing what I did best. Shaping moments into narrative, turning raw experience into story. Part 3. The ordinary world. The Friday after Thanksgiving, I woke to find the house already half empty. The Hendersons and the Martins had left early, citing Black Friday shopping plans that seemed to require a pre-dawn departure. Uncle Stephen and Aunt Carol were packing up their car in the driveway, moving with the efficient haste of people who'd fulfilled their obligation and were eager to reclaim their normal lives. The cousins had vanished entirely, presumably back to their respective apartments and commitments. I came downstairs to find Mom in the kitchen, working her way through the mountain of leftovers, sorting them into containers with the kind of systematic precision she usually reserved for organizing the church newsletter mailing. Dad sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper in actual physical form, one of his retirement indulgences after decades of only catching headlines during rushed morning commutes. "Morning, sweetie. Coffee's fresh." Mom gestured toward the pot without looking up from her Tupperware arrangement. "Thanks." I poured myself a cup and joined Dad at the table. He lowered his newspaper enough to peer at me over the top edge, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. "Sleep okay?" "Fine. You?" "Like a rock. Always do after a big meal. Something about turkey and all those carbohydrates just knocks me out." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that happens between people who've spent enough time together that words aren't always necessary. Outside, I could hear Uncle Stephen's voice raised in what sounded like an argument with Aunt Carol about whether they'd packed everything, a familiar married dynamic that played out every time they went anywhere. "Mandy and Derek are coming by around noon," Mom said, snapping a lid onto a container of mashed potatoes. "They're going to take some leftovers, and Mandy wants to pick up that serving platter she brought. The big white one with the scalloped edges." "Okay. And I thought maybe we could all go through some old photo albums this afternoon. I've been meaning to organize them for years, and it seems like a nice low-key thing to do while everyone's still in town." "Sure." Dad folded his newspaper and stood, carrying his empty mug to the sink. "I'm going to work on the trains for a bit. Let me know when lunch is." He disappeared toward the basement, and Mom continued her leftover organization, humming something that might have been a hymn or might have been a commercial jingle. It was hard to tell. I sipped my coffee and watched her work, noticing details I'd overlooked before. How her hands moved with automatic confidence, no wasted motion. How she'd labeled each container with its contents and the date in neat marker script. How she'd already planned out which dishes would become tomorrow's meals, extending the Thanksgiving abundance as far as it would stretch. She'd always been like this, efficient and practical, the kind of person who could stretch $1 or a turkey for days beyond what seemed possible. Growing up, I'd taken it for granted, this invisible machinery that kept the household running. Only now, watching her from a distance, both physical and emotional, could I see it as a skill rather than just the natural order of things. "When did you learn to do all this?" I asked. "Do what, honey?" "The organizing, the planning ahead, all of it." She paused, considering the question like it had never occurred to her before. "I don't know that I learned it exactly. It's just what you do when you're responsible for feeding people. You figure out what works and you keep doing it. Did your mom teach you? Some of it, I suppose. But she worked full-time, so I spent a lot of time figuring things out on my own. Trial and error mostly. She went back to her containers, but something in her posture had shifted, become more thoughtful. After a moment she added, your grandmother, my mother, she wasn't much for domestic things. She was more interested in her job at the library. So when it came to running a house, I mostly learned from watching other people's mothers and then trying things until they worked. I absorbed this information, fitting it into a larger picture I was beginning to assemble. The patterns repeated, generation to generation, women learning to hold things together because someone had to, and the alternative was chaos. Did you ever resent it? I asked. Having to figure it all out yourself? Mom turned to look at me fully, her hands going still. It's not about resentment, Natalie. It's about responsibility. When you have a family, you do what needs doing. That's just how it works. Even when nobody notices. Her expression flickered, something uncomfortable moving behind her eyes. People notice. Do they? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she sealed another container, placed it in the refrigerator, and then stood there with the door open longer than necessary, cold air spilling out into the kitchen. Your father notices, she said finally. Maybe not in words, but he knows. And you girls, you turned out fine. That's the real recognition, isn't it? Knowing you did your job well enough that your children are okay? I wanted to push back, to point out the flaws in that logic, the way it erased the person doing the work in favor of the results they produced. But Mom had already moved on, closing the refrigerator and picking up her next container. The moment of vulnerability sealed away as efficiently as the leftovers. The rest of the morning passed in that peculiar limbo that follows major holidays, the sense of time suspended between celebration and normal life. I took a shower, packed most of my things, and checked my email on my laptop in the guest room. The client had responded to my tentative expression of interest, saying they'd love to set up a call next week to discuss the project parameters. I starred the message, making a mental note to follow up. Mandy and Derek arrived exactly at noon, pulling into the driveway in their Lexus SUV that still had temporary plates. Through the window I watched them get out, Mandy checking her reflection in the side mirror and adjusting her hair, Derek reaching back into the car for reusable shopping bags they'd apparently brought for leftover transport. They came in through the front door without knocking, a privilege of family. Mandy's voice carried through the house before I saw her, bright and energetic in a way that suggested she'd already had at least 2 cups of coffee. Hello. We come bearing empty containers and ambitious appetites for free food. Mom met them in the hallway with hugs and cheek kisses. Perfect timing. I've got everything organized and ready to divide up. I stayed upstairs for a few more minutes, giving them time to settle in before making my own appearance. When I finally came down, I found them all in the kitchen, Mandy surveying the array of leftovers like a general planning a campaign. Oh good, there's plenty of turkey left. Derek, we should take enough for sandwiches this week. And I definitely want some of that stuffing. I want to try reheating it in the waffle iron. I saw this recipe online that looked amazing. Derek nodded, loading containers into their bags while Mandy directed traffic. I leaned against the doorframe watching the operation and caught Dad's eye. He'd emerged from the basement at some point, drawn by the activity. He gave me a small smile that felt like solidarity, 2 people observing rather than participating. Natalie, you'll want to take some of this too, right? Mom asked, suddenly remembering my existence. You have that long flight tomorrow. Leftovers would be perfect for when you get home. Sure, whatever's left is fine. Mandy glanced up. Oh, are you leaving tomorrow? I thought you were staying through the weekend. Flight's cheaper on Saturday. And I have a client meeting Monday I need to prep for. Always working. She said it lightly, but there was an edge underneath, like my dedication to my career was somehow an accusation against her choices. That's the freelance life, I replied evenly. No vacation days or sick leave. If I'm not working, I'm not earning. Sounds stressful. It has its moments. Derek finished packing their bags and hefted them with the exaggerated effort of someone who wanted credit for carrying things. All set. We should probably get going, babe. Your mom's expecting us at 2. Oh right, I almost forgot. Mom's having some people over for leftover casseroles. She does this thing every year where she combines everyone's Thanksgiving leftovers into new dishes. It's actually kind of genius. That sounds fun, Mom said, in a tone that meant she wished she'd been invited. You guys should come. Mandy said it spontaneously, or at least made it sound spontaneous. I'm sure Mom would love to have you. The more the merrier. Oh, we wouldn't want to impose, Mom replied, using the standard Midwestern deflection that meant she absolutely wanted to go but needed to be convinced. It's not imposing. It's family. Right, Derek? Derek nodded obediently. Absolutely. Come on over. Should be a good time. I watched this exchange with detached fascination, the way obligations transformed into invitations, how plans materialized through suggestion rather than direct asking. The net result would be my parents spending their afternoon at Derek's mother's house, extending the holiday socializing by another day, but nobody would quite remember who'd actually initiated the plan. What time should we arrive? Dad asked, apparently making the decision for both of them. Let's say 3:30. That gives you time to relax a bit first. Perfect. We'll be there. Mandy turned to me, an afterthought of inclusion. You too, Nat. If you want. I have to finish packing and return the rental car, but thanks. She accepted this easily, visibly relieved to not have to incorporate me into whatever afternoon she'd envisioned. Okay, well, next time you're in town we should do something just the two of us. Sister time. Definitely. We both knew it wouldn't happen, but saying it fulfilled some requirement, maintained the fiction that our relationship was closer than it actually was. They left shortly after, Mandy hugging everyone, Derek shaking Dad's hand, both of them loaded down with enough food to feed them through the weekend. Mom stood at the door waving until they backed out of the driveway, then turned to Dad with barely contained excitement. Isn't that nice? We get to meet Derek's mother properly. I've only seen her at the wedding and we barely got to talk. Better change out of these sweatpants then, Dad said mildly, heading upstairs. Mom disappeared upstairs to coordinate her own outfit change, leaving me alone in the kitchen surrounded by the remaining leftovers. I started gathering things for myself, portioning out modest amounts into the mismatched containers Mom had designated for my use. Nothing fancy, mostly old margarine tubs and yogurt containers that had been washed and repurposed, the kind of storage solutions that spoke to a lifetime of waste not want not mentality. I worked methodically, sealing each container and stacking them in a cardboard box I'd found in the pantry. Turkey stuffing, a scoop of mashed potatoes that had started to form a skin on top, green beans that had gone slightly mushy from reheating, a slice of pumpkin pie in a sandwich bag. It looked depressing, this collection of aging holiday food, but I took it anyway because refusing would have required an explanation I didn't want to give. The house grew quiet around me as Mom and Dad prepared for their afternoon plans. I could hear water running upstairs, drawers opening and closing, the domestic sounds of people getting ready to present themselves to the world. I finished my packing and carried the box to the guest room, setting it on the dresser next to my suitcase. Then I sat on the bed and pulled out my laptop again. The footage from yesterday was still queued up, and I found myself watching it again, this time with fresh eyes after a night's sleep and some distance from the immediate emotion of the experience. What struck me most on this viewing was how ordinary it all looked. Nobody was being overtly cruel or obviously excluding me. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no moments that would make sense in a melodrama. Just a family gathering where attention and care flowed in predictable patterns, and those patterns happened to leave one person on the margins. The camera captured something I'd felt but never quite articulated. The difference between being present and being included. I was there, in the frame, occasionally visible in the background or when someone passed dishes my way. But the real action, the emotional center of the gathering, existed in a space I couldn't quite reach. Like watching a play from the wings instead of from a seat in the audience, I could see everything but couldn't quite experience it the way it was meant to be experienced. I scrubbed through the footage, looking for a specific moment I remembered. Found it around the 40-minute mark. Mandy was telling a story about something that had happened at one of her open houses. A potential buyer who'd brought their pet parrot to the showing. She did the voices, acted out the parts, had everyone laughing. The camera had captured the table during this moment, and what I saw was striking. Every face was turned toward her, every expression engaged and delighted. Even the cousins had looked up from their phones. Then the camera angle shifted slightly, and I could see my own face in the edge of the frame. I was smiling too, laughing at the story like everyone else. But there was something hollow in the expression. a performance of enjoyment rather than genuine participation. I looked like someone who'd learned to mirror the emotions around them without actually feeling them. I closed the laptop before I could spiral too far into that observation. There was something deeply unsettling about watching yourself from the outside, seeing the gaps between how you thought you appeared and how you actually looked. It was like hearing your voice on a recording and not recognizing it as your own, except more profound, more revealing of fundamental truths you've been avoiding. Mom called up the stairs. "Natalie, we're heading out. Will you be here when we get back?" "Probably not. I need to return the car and get to the airport early." "Okay, well, come say goodbye before you leave." "I will." I heard the front door open and close, the sound of the car starting in the driveway, then pulling away. The house settled into complete silence, the kind that feels almost physical after days of constant noise and activity. I sat in it for a while, letting it wrap around me like a blanket. Then I did what I always did when I needed to process something. I started working. I opened my editing software and imported all the footage I'd captured over the past 2 days. Not just the dinner but everything. The arrivals, the preparations, the casual conversations, the aftermath. Hours of material that needed to be organized, tagged, and shaped into something coherent. I worked without a clear plan at first, just sorting clips by subject and time, creating the basic architecture that would allow me to find specific moments later. But as I worked, patterns emerged. The way Mandy appeared in nearly every frame, not because I'd focused on her, but because she naturally gravitated toward wherever the action was. The way conversations shifted when she entered a room, people straightening slightly, smiling more broadly, adjusting their energy to match hers. And then there were the moments where I appeared, almost always in transition, moving from one place to another, carrying something, fulfilling some function. I was rarely stationary, rarely at rest, rarely just existing in the moment without a purpose. Even when I sat at the dinner table, the footage showed me passing dishes, refilling water glasses, clearing plates. Always doing something, never simply being. I created a rough assembly, nothing polished, just a sequence of clips that told a story. The story of a family gathering where one person existed primarily in service to everyone else's comfort and enjoyment. I didn't add music or effects, didn't manipulate the footage beyond basic editing. Just let the moments speak for themselves, arranged in an order that revealed the pattern underneath. When I finished, the rough cut ran about 12 minutes. I watched it through once, then twice, then a third time. Each viewing made the pattern clearer, harder to rationalize away. This wasn't about individual moments being unfair or unkind. It was about a system, a family structure that had organized itself around certain assumptions about who mattered and how. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Having a wonderful time at Patricia's house. She makes the best sweet potato casserole. Hope you're enjoying your quiet afternoon." I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Glad you're having fun. I'll leave the key under the mat when I go." Her reply came quickly. "Safe travels tomorrow. Love you." "Love you too." I set the phone down and looked around the guest room. This space that had once been mine and was now just a generic bedroom for whoever needed it. The walls were painted a neutral beige. The artwork was mass-produced prints of flowers and landscapes, the kind you'd find in a hotel. Nothing personal remained, no trace of the teenager who'd lived here, covered the walls with band posters, and stayed up late reading by flashlight under the covers. That erasure felt symbolic somehow, part of the larger pattern. When I'd left for college, Mandy had moved into this room because it was bigger, had better light. Mom had redecorated to suit Mandy's taste, which ran toward soft pinks and whites and delicate things. Then when Mandy moved out, Mom had redecorated again. This time into neutrality, creating a space that welcomed everyone by belonging to no one. My old room, the smaller one down the hall, had become Dad's office after he retired. His trains occupied most of the floor space, miniature landscapes with tiny buildings and trees. I'd looked in there earlier, seen how completely it had transformed into his domain. Not a trace remained of the little girl who'd learned to write her name on those walls, who'd measured her height against the doorframe every birthday. I understood the practicality of it. Empty bedrooms got repurposed. That's what happened when children grew up and moved away. But understanding didn't make it feel less like being slowly edited out of the family story. My presence reduced to holiday visits and phone calls that grew increasingly sporadic. I spent the rest of the afternoon finishing my packing and tidying the guest room, stripping the bed and leaving the used towels in the hamper the way Mom preferred. Then I carried my things downstairs and loaded them into the rental car, including the box of leftovers that I'd probably throw away when I got home because airport security wouldn't let me bring them through, and I wasn't about to check a bag just for aging turkey. Before leaving, I walked through the house one more time, a habit from childhood, making sure lights were off and doors were locked. In the living room, I paused by the photo wall, studying the collection of family moments frozen in frames. There was my high school graduation photo, me in cap and gown looking uncomfortable and young. Below it, Mandy's graduation, then her wedding, each image larger and more prominently displayed than mine. The most recent addition was a professional portrait of Mandy and Derek, the one from the apple orchard with the coordinated sweaters. It occupied the central position, the spot that drew the eye first when you entered the room. Around it, older photos faded into the background, including several of me at various ages that looked increasingly yellowed and outdated by comparison. I took out my phone and photographed the entire wall, not for any particular reason, just to have a record. Then I locked up, left the key under the mat as promised, and drove away from my childhood home as the November afternoon faded into early evening. The rental car return went smoothly, and I caught the shuttle to the airport with time to spare. I checked in for my flight, made it through security, and found myself with 3 hours to kill before boarding. I bought an overpriced salad at one of the terminal restaurants and found a seat by the window where I could watch planes take off and land. My phone buzzed periodically with messages from friends back in Portland asking how Thanksgiving had been. I gave non-committal answers. Fine, good to see family, lots of food. The usual responses that communicated nothing meaningful. One friend, Rachel, who knew me better than most, pressed a little harder. You okay? You sound weird. Just tired. Long weekend. If you want to talk when you get back, I'm around. Thanks. I'll let you know. I appreciated the offer but couldn't imagine how to explain what I was feeling. It all sounded so petty when reduced to words. My family had a holiday dinner and I sat at the end of the table. My sister got attention and I didn't. Nobody remembered to save me a warm roll. These complaints sounded trivial, the whining of someone who couldn't handle not being the center of attention. But it wasn't about attention, not really. It was about recognition, about being seen as a full person, rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. It was about the cumulative weight of 1,000 small moments where you were treated as optional, as an afterthought, as someone whose presence was appreciated, but whose absence wouldn't fundamentally change anything. I opened my laptop and pulled up the rough cut I'd assembled earlier. Watching it in the airport, surrounded by strangers and the constant announcements about gates and delays, it hit differently than it had in the quiet of the guest room. Here it looked like evidence, not of malice or cruelty, but of something more insidious. A family system that had sorted people into categories of importance, and I had been categorized as less essential than I'd wanted to believe. An idea started forming, still vague but gaining shape. What if I finished this edit? What if I turned it into something more than just raw footage, transformed it into an actual short documentary? Not to post publicly or send to anyone, just to prove to myself that what I'd experienced was real and documentable. Or maybe, a quieter voice suggested, maybe it could be more than that. Maybe it could be the opening chapter of that larger project about invisible labor, the one that never got funded. Maybe this personal story could be the key that unlocked a broader exploration of family dynamics and unacknowledged work, and all the ways people disappeared while standing right in front of you. My flight was called. I packed up my laptop and joined the line of people shuffling toward the gate, boarding passes in hand, carry-ons bumping against legs. I found my seat, a middle one because I'd booked late, wedged between a businessman who immediately put on noise-canceling headphones and a college student who spent the taxi and takeoff period texting rapidly with both thumbs. As the plane lifted off, I watched Ohio shrink beneath us, the city lights spreading out in geometric patterns that looked almost beautiful from this height. Somewhere down there, my family was probably finishing up their afternoon at Derek's mother's house, maybe heading home full of leftover casseroles and new inside jokes I'd never hear. Tomorrow they'd wake up and continue their lives, and my visit would fade into memory. Another Thanksgiving checked off the calendar. But for me, something had shifted. The camera had shown me what I couldn't see while living it, and now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. The pattern was there, documented and undeniable. The question was what to do with that knowledge, Whether to let it sit in my hard drive like all the other family footage I'd captured over the years, or whether to do something more active with it. The flight attendant came by with drinks. I ordered a ginger ale and pretended to read the magazine from the seat pocket, but my mind was elsewhere, already editing, already shaping narrative from raw material. By the time we landed in Portland 3 hours later, I'd mentally mapped out the entire structure of what the piece could be. A meditation on visibility and erasure, using my own family as the case study but expanding outward to explore how these patterns played out in countless households. I caught a rideshare home, letting the familiar streets of my neighborhood ground me back in my real life, the one I'd built for myself far away from Ohio and family dinners and dry bread. My apartment looked exactly as I'd left it, which was both comforting and somehow disappointing. Part of me had expected it to look different, to reflect the internal shifts I'd experienced over the past few days. I unloaded my suitcase, threw away the box of leftovers without even opening it, and made myself a cup of tea from the kettle that lived on my kitchen counter. Then I sat at my desk, opened my laptop and looked at the rough cut one more time. Tomorrow I'd have that call with the client about the new documentary project. I'd pitch them on this idea, see if they had any interest in exploring family dynamics and emotional labor. They said no, I'd find another way to fund it. Use my own money if I had to. Because suddenly this felt urgent, necessary in a way that had nothing to do with career advancement or portfolio building. This was about taking all those years of being the family documentarian, of preserving everyone else's memories and stories, and finally using those skills to tell my own truth. Not to hurt anyone or seek revenge, but simply to hold up a mirror and say, this is what it looks like when you're slowly edited out of your own family story. This is what invisible feels like when you finally find a way to make it visible. I stayed up late into the night, refining the edit, adding text cards that provided context without over-explaining, selecting a subtle score that enhanced emotion without manipulating it. By 3 in the morning, I had something that felt close to complete. A 12-minute piece that told a simple story about a family dinner where one person was physically present, but emotionally absent from the gathering's heart. Before I could second-guess myself, I exported the file and saved it with a simple title, Dry Bread. Then I closed the laptop, made my way to bed, and fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from travel and emotion and the particular tiredness that comes from finally seeing something you've been trying not to look at for years. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, the first thing I did was check my phone. No messages from family, which wasn't surprising. They were probably sleeping in after their busy holiday weekend, returning to their normal routines, already forgetting the specific details of who sat where and who got what. But I remembered. The camera remembered. And now that memory existed in permanent form, shaped and structured and ready to be witnessed. What I chose to do with it, whether to keep it private or share it more widely, was a decision for another day. For now, it was enough to know that I'd finally stopped documenting other people's stories long enough to claim my own. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling my apartment with that rich morning smell that meant caffeine and consciousness were imminent. I checked my calendar while waiting for it to brew. The client call was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, which gave me the whole morning to prepare my pitch. I needed to figure out how to present this idea, this documentary about invisible labor and family dynamics, in a way that felt professional rather than personal, universal rather than specific. But as I reviewed my notes and sketched out talking points, I kept coming back to the footage, to those 12 minutes that captured something I'd never quite been able to articulate in words. Maybe the pitch didn't need to be abstract and theoretical. Maybe I just needed to show them what I'd created. Let the work speak for itself. I spent the morning refining that strategy, preparing to screen Dry Bread during the call, and then use it as a jumping-off point for discussing the larger project. It felt risky, exposing something so personal to potential clients. But it also felt right, like I was finally using my skills and experience in service of something that mattered beyond just paying bills and building a portfolio. At 1:50, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and settled in front of my computer, joining the video call with 2 minutes to spare. The clients appeared on screen. A woman named Jennifer who ran the nonprofit and her colleague Marcus who handled their communications. I'd worked with them before on the homeless youth project, so we had an established rapport which made this slightly less terrifying. We exchanged pleasantries, caught up briefly on how our respective Thanksgivings had gone. Then Jennifer leaned forward slightly, The universal video call signal for getting down to business. So, Natalie, you mentioned you had an idea for the next project. We're really interested in hearing what you're thinking. I took a breath, committed to the approach I'd settled on. Actually, I made something over the holiday that I think illustrates what I have in mind. Would you be open to watching a short piece about 12 minutes and then discussing it? They exchanged glances, curious but willing. Sure, absolutely. Want to screen share it? I did, pulling up the file and hitting play. Then I muted my microphone and watched their faces as they watched my family dinner. My relegation to the table's end, my sister's performance at the center of everything. I'd seen the footage so many times by now that I could predict every moment, every cut, every reveal. But watching them watch it, seeing their expressions shift from polite interest to something deeper, that was new. When it ended, there was a moment of silence. Then Marcus spoke first. Wow, that was incredibly powerful. And subtle. You never have to say what's happening, we can just see it. Jennifer nodded slowly. The way you structured it, showing the pattern rather than just individual moments, that's really effective. You can't write it off as someone being sensitive or reading too much into things. It's just there, undeniable. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady. This is what I want to explore for the larger project. Invisible labor in families, the people who hold things together but don't get recognized for it. The emotional work that goes unnoticed because it's expected rather than exceptional. And you want to use your own family as the primary case study? Jennifer asked. Partially. I think my story is a way in, a specific example that makes the abstract concrete. But then I want to interview other people, document other families, show how this pattern plays out across different contexts and relationships. Marcus was already nodding. I think this could be really compelling. Everyone has some version of this in their family, someone who's taken for granted or overlooked. It's universal but rarely talked about. We spent the next hour discussing logistics, timeline, budget. They were more enthusiastic than I dared hope, already brainstorming ways to structure the longer documentary, potential interview subjects, distribution strategies. By the time the call ended, I had a green light to move forward, funding secured, and a timeline that gave me 6 months to complete the project. After they disconnected, I sat staring at my blank screen, processing what had just happened. I'd turned my most painful family experience into the foundation for professional work, transformed private hurt into public exploration. It felt strange and risky and also somehow exactly right, like I'd finally figured out how to use my skills in service of truth, rather than just pretty pictures and polished narratives. My phone buzzed. A text from Mandy, the first communication from her since I'd left Ohio. Hey, just wanted to check in. Safe travels yesterday? Hope you made it home okay. I looked at the message for a long time before responding. Yes, got home fine. Thanks for asking. Her reply was immediate. Good. Mom said. You seemed quiet during the visit. Everything okay? Everything's fine. 3 dots appeared, indicating she was typing, then disappeared. Then appeared again. Finally a message came through. Okay, well, if you ever want to talk, I'm here. I know we don't always connect, but you're still my sister. I appreciated that, I typed, which was true even if incomplete. Let's plan that sister time next visit. Definitely. Love you. Love you too. I set the phone down and looked out my apartment window at the gray Portland afternoon. Rain starting to speckle the glass. Mandy meant well, I knew that. They all meant well in their way. The problem wasn't malice or intentional cruelty. The problem was a system that had developed over decades, roles that had calcified into expectations, patterns that everyone had stopped questioning because they'd become invisible through familiarity. And maybe that's what the documentary needed to explore. Not villains and victims, but the way families create structures that serve some people better than others, often without anyone consciously deciding that's what they're doing. The way love and harm can coexist, how you can care about people while also erasing them, value them while also taking them for granted. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the project with an intensity that surprised even me. I conducted preliminary interviews with people who'd responded to my call for subjects, mostly through social media and community boards. I talked to adult children who'd been family caretakers, to siblings who'd lived in more successful brothers' and sisters' shadows, to spouses who'd done the invisible work of household management while their partners got credit for breadwinning. Each story had its own specifics, its own details and characters and dynamics. But underneath, the same pattern emerged again and again. Someone had been essential to their family's functioning while being treated as optional to their family's narrative. Someone had given and given and given, and then looked around one day to realize nobody had noticed, or if they'd noticed, they'd simply accepted it as the natural order of things. I organized the footage, created preliminary cuts, started shaping the arc of how the documentary would unfold. And at the center of it all was my own story, my own family dinner, that piece of dry bread that had somehow become the catalyst for everything else. Christmas approached, and with it came the inevitable question of whether I'd come home for the holidays. Mom called in mid-December, her voice bright with forced casualness. "So, what are your plans for Christmas? We'd love to have you home if you can make it. I'm actually swamped with a project right now. I don't think I can get away." Oh, she sounded genuinely disappointed, which made it harder. "Well, what about New Year's? Just a quiet few days, nothing fancy. Let me see how the work goes and get back to you." "Okay, honey. We miss you, you know." "I miss you too, Mom." After we hung up, I sat with the guilt for a while, letting it settle in my chest like something heavy and cold. I did miss them, in the complicated way you can miss people who hurt you without meaning to, who love you in ways that somehow still leave you feeling alone. But I also knew that going back for Christmas would mean stepping back into those same patterns, sitting at that same table, occupying that same marginal space in their lives. And I wasn't ready for that yet. Not while I was still building something from the wreckage of Thanksgiving, not while the footage was still raw and the project was still taking shape. I needed distance to see clearly, space to understand what I was really documenting. The week before Christmas, I conducted an interview that changed how I thought about the entire project. Her name was Veronica, a woman in her mid-50s who'd responded to my call for subjects with a message that was brief but compelling. "I spent 30 years making sure everyone else's life worked, and nobody noticed until I stopped." We met at a coffee shop in Southeast Portland, one of those places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls that never quite sells. Veronica arrived exactly on time, dressed in jeans and a practical fleece jacket, her gray hair cut short and efficient. She had the kind of face that looked like it smiled easily, but when she sat down across from me, her expression was guarded, like she was still deciding whether this had been a good idea. I set up my camera discreetly, just my smaller rig that wouldn't draw attention from other customers. Veronica watched the preparation with interest. "You do this often? Interview strangers about their families?" "More often lately," I admitted. "This project has kind of taken over my life." "What made you want to do it?" I showed her a clip from Dry Bread, just a minute or so, enough to give her the context. She watched without comment, but something in her posture shifted, a recognition passing across her features. "The bread," she said when it finished. "That's perfect. It's always something small like that, isn't it? Something you could explain away if you tried, but that somehow captures everything." "Exactly." She took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. Then she started talking and I just listened, occasionally asking a clarifying question but mostly letting her story unfold at its own pace. Veronica had been the middle child in a family of 5 kids, the one who'd naturally fallen into the caretaker role when their mother got sick. She was 12 when the cancer diagnosis came, 14 when her mother died. In those 2 years and the years that followed, she'd learned to cook full meals, manage household finances, get her younger siblings to school on time, forge her father's signature on permission slips because he was too overwhelmed to deal with the paperwork of parenting. Her older siblings had been spared most of it, already teenagers with their own lives, their own friends, their own worlds that existed separate from the crisis consuming their home. Her younger siblings had been protected from it, kept innocent as long as possible while Veronica absorbed the weight of keeping everything functional. "Nobody asked me to do it," she said. "Just happened. Someone had to, and I was there and I was capable, so it became my job. And then it stayed my job even after the emergency was over, even after Dad remarried and we had a stepmother who theoretically could have taken over." "Why didn't she?" I asked. Veronica laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because by then, the family had organized itself around me being that person. I was the one who remembered everyone's schedules, who coordinated holidays, who made sure birthday cards got sent and doctor's appointments got made. Trying to step back from that felt like abandoning everyone, like being selfish." "Did you ever try?" "Once. When I was in my 30s, married, had my own kid. I told everyone I needed them to handle their own stuff for a while, that I was overwhelmed and needed support instead of always being the support. You know what happened? What? Chaos. My sister missed my dad's birthday entirely. My brother showed up to Christmas without bringing the dish he'd promised. Nobody coordinated who was bringing what, so we ended up with 4 green bean casseroles and no rolls. And everyone looked at me like, see? This is why we need you. So you went back to doing it. What choice did I have? The alternative was watching everything fall apart and knowing I could have prevented it. We talked for almost 2 hours, her story spilling out in a way that suggested she'd been holding it for a long time, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. She told me about her father's funeral, how she'd organized the entire service while her siblings showed up and cried and accepted condolences, how afterward someone had said what a beautiful tribute it was and she'd wanted to scream that she'd written every word of the eulogy, selected every photo in the slideshow, coordinated every detail while also grieving the loss of her last parent. She told me about her own daughter, now in college, and how Veronica had consciously tried to break the pattern, to not raise a caretaker, to not pass down that particular inheritance. But she worried she'd overcorrected, created a child who expected to be taken care of rather than learning to care for others. It's impossible to get it right, she said. Either you repeat what was done to you or you try so hard not to repeat it that you create different problems. After the interview, I sat in my car for a long time, camera equipment piled on the passenger seat, reviewing the footage on my laptop's small screen. Veronica's story was different from mine in its specifics but identical in its structure. The mechanics of invisible labor. The way families unconsciously designated certain people as essential infrastructure, while treating them as optional characters. I drove home through the gray Portland drizzle, windshield wipers keeping rhythm with my thoughts. The documentary was starting to take shape, not just as an exploration of a problem but as something more complex. An examination of how people get trapped in roles they never consciously chose, how family systems perpetuate themselves through generations, how love and obligation become so tangled that you can't separate them without potentially destroying both. That night, I returned to my own footage with fresh perspective. I'd been editing it as a story of neglect, of being overlooked and undervalued. But watching it again after Veronica's interview, I saw something more nuanced. My family hadn't set out to erase me. They just organized themselves in a way that worked for them, and that organization happened to leave me on the margins. It was structural rather than personal, which somehow made it both less painful and more difficult to address. Because if someone is intentionally cruel, you can confront them, demand change, draw boundaries. But what do you do when the cruelty is ambient, built into the system itself, perpetuated by people who love you but can't see what they're doing? Christmas came and went. I stayed in Portland, spent the day alone by choice, working on the documentary, and occasionally video chatting with friends who were also spending the holiday away from family. Mom sent photos from their celebration, Mandy's house this year. Everyone gathered around a tree that looked professionally decorated. I was mentioned once in the family group chat. Wish Natalie could be here, Mom had written, followed by a sad emoji. I didn't respond, just liked the message and moved on. The new year arrived with the usual Portland weather, rain and gray and occasional breaks of startling blue sky that made you remember why you lived in the Pacific Northwest, despite the months of gloom. I worked steadily through January and into February, conducting more interviews, gathering more footage, building a comprehensive picture of how invisible labor functioned across different family structures. Each person I interviewed brought their own story, but common threads emerged. The sibling who'd managed aging parents while brothers and sisters contributed nothing, but showed up to claim inheritance. The wife who'd run the household and raised the children while her husband built a career, then divorced her and claimed she'd never done anything productive. The adult child who'd sacrificed their own dreams to care for a disabled family member, then was criticized for not having accomplished more with their life. Stories of people who'd given everything and received little acknowledgement, who'd kept families functional through sheer force of will, who'd made themselves small so others could be big. By March, I had enough material to start assembling the full documentary. I worked in marathon sessions, sometimes going 16 hours straight, forgetting to eat or sleep as I shaped the narrative. The piece was structured in 3 acts. First, the establishment of the pattern through multiple perspectives including my own. Second, an exploration of how these patterns developed, the psychological and social factors that created and sustained them. Third, interviews with people who'd managed to break free or at least renegotiate their roles, showing what change looked like and what it cost. The rough cut ran 90 minutes. Far longer than I'd initially planned, but every minute felt necessary. I sent it to Jennifer and Marcus for feedback, nervous about whether I'd gone too personal, whether the piece would work for audiences beyond people who'd lived this specific experience. Their response came within days. They loved it. More than that, they thought it had the potential to reach beyond the nonprofit circuit, maybe get into film festivals, maybe even theatrical distribution if we were strategic about it. But there's one thing missing, Jennifer wrote in her notes. We never see the resolution with your own family. We see you discover the pattern, document it, understand it. But we don't see what you do with that understanding. Does the documentary itself become part of the story? I sat with that feedback for a week, resistance and recognition warring in my chest. She was right, obviously. The documentary couldn't just expose the problem. It needed to explore what happened when you tried to address it. But that meant going back, confronting my family with what I'd created, documenting their response. It meant making myself visible in a way I'd spent my entire life avoiding. In early April, I called my mother. We'd spoken occasionally over the past months, brief conversations about weather and work and neutral topics that required no emotional investment. But this call had a different weight to it, and she seemed to sense it immediately. Is everything okay? She asked after we'd gotten through the preliminaries. Yes. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been working on a documentary project about families, and it involves some footage from Thanksgiving. Oh, how nice. What kind of documentary? It's about invisible labor. About people who hold families together but don't get recognized for it. Pause longer than comfortable. And you're using our Thanksgiving? Some footage from it, yes. As an example of certain family dynamics. Another pause. I see. Can I watch it before it goes anywhere public? Actually, that's why I'm calling. I'd like to come home and show it to everyone. Have a family viewing. Get your perspectives on it. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Mom spoke, her voice careful. Natalie, is this about you feeling left out at dinner? Because if you'd said something at the time, we could have addressed it. It's bigger than one dinner, Mom. But I'd rather talk about it in person when everyone can see what I've created and we can have a real conversation about it. I don't know if that's a good idea. You know how your sister is about conflict. I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking for understanding. She agreed finally to set something up for the following month. Said she'd talk to Dad and Mandy and Derek, see if they'd be willing to watch something I'd made. Her tone suggested she was already dreading it, already imagining worst-case scenarios where I ambushed them with accusations and blame. But that wasn't what I wanted. The documentary wasn't an attack, it was an invitation to see things differently, to recognize patterns that had been invisible, because they were too familiar to notice. I booked a flight for mid-May, gave them 3 weeks to prepare. In that time I finalized the edit, adding a new final section that would document this homecoming, this attempt at conversation. I set up a plan to film it, discrete cameras that would capture the viewing and the discussion that followed. The night before my flight, I barely slept. I kept running through possible scenarios, imagining how they might react. Best case. They watched with open minds, saw themselves in the footage, understood what I'd been trying to communicate. Worst case. They got defensive, denied everything, accused me of betraying family privacy for professional gain. Most likely. Something in between, messy and complicated and unresolved, because that's how real families operated outside of tidy documentary narratives. The flight to Columbus felt longer than usual, every minute stretched by anticipation and dread. I picked up another rental car, drove the familiar route to Mapleton, arrived at my parents' house just as the spring afternoon was softening into evening. The trees were fully green now, flower beds blooming with colors that seemed almost aggressive after Portland's muted palette. Mom answered the door before I could knock, pulling me into a hug that felt tighter than usual. You look thin, she said, studying my face. Are you eating enough? I'm fine, Mom. She led me inside where everyone was already gathered. Dad in his usual chair, Mandy and Derek on the couch, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from curious to apprehensive. I'd asked Mom to set up the TV so I could play the documentary through it, wanted them to watch on a proper screen rather than huddled around a laptop. So, Mandy said with forced brightness, Mom says you made a movie about us. A documentary. About family dynamics. You're part of it, but it's bigger than just our family. Sounds ominous, Derek muttered, but nobody laughed. I connected my laptop to their TV, pulled up the file, and before I could second-guess myself, hit play. Then I sat in the chair farthest from the screen, watching their faces instead of the documentary I'd already seen hundreds of times. The piece opened with footage from various families, establishing the theme of invisible labor before narrowing in on my own story. The Thanksgiving dinner appeared about 15 minutes in, those carefully edited sequences showing the preparation, the seating arrangements, the distribution of attention and food. I watched Mom's face tighten as she recognized their dining room, their table, herself moving through the kitchen. Dad leaned forward, frowning at the screen like it was a puzzle he needed to solve. Mandy's expression was harder to read, cycling through surprise and discomfort, and something that might have been recognition. The documentary continued, weaving my story with others, showing patterns that transcended any single family. Veronica appeared, along with 6 other interview subjects I'd found over the past months. Each told their story of being essential but unacknowledged, of doing the work that held everything together while others got the credit. Then it returned to my footage, showing moments I'd captured over the years, all those family gatherings where I was behind the camera instead of in the frame. The pattern became undeniable when laid out across time, accumulating weight with each additional example. The documentary didn't narrate or explain beyond what the interview subjects provided. It trusted the audience to see what was there, to draw their own conclusions. And sitting in that living room watching my family watch themselves, I couldn't tell if that trust was warranted or misplaced. The final section showed me editing the footage, talking about why I'd made the piece, what I hoped it would illuminate. Then the screen faded to black, and we sat in silence as the credits rolled over that darkness. Nobody spoke for what felt like an hour but was probably only a minute. Then Dad cleared his throat. "That's quite a piece of work, Natalie. Very professional." The comment hung in the air. Appreciated but insufficient. I waited for more. Mandy spoke next, her voice tight. "So this is how you see us? As people who used you and ignored you? It's how the camera sees us. I'm just showing what was there. But you chose what to show. You could have included plenty of moments where we did acknowledge you, where we were kind. I included what was representative of the overall pattern. That's what documentary does." Mom stood abruptly, moving to the window and looking out at their darkening yard. "I didn't realize you felt this way. If you told us, we could have done things differently. I shouldn't have to tell you to include me at my own family's gatherings." "You were included," Mandy said, her volume rising slightly. "You were there. You ate the same food, you were part of it." "Was I though? Look at the footage, Mandy. Really look at it. Where am I in any of those moments? I'm there physically, but I'm not actually part of what's happening." Derek shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe this is just about different expectations. Some people need more attention than others." "It's not about attention," I said, fighting to keep my voice level. "It's about recognition. About being seen as a full person, not just as someone who shows up and fulfills a function." Dad finally joined the conversation, his tone measured and careful. "I think what your mother is trying to say is that we didn't mean to make you feel this way. If we'd known, we would have acted differently." "But that's exactly the point," I replied. "You shouldn't have to know. The fact that you could treat me this way without realizing it, that's the problem. It's not about individual intentions, it's about patterns that have developed over years, roles we've all fallen into without questioning them." Mom turned from the window, her eyes wet. "So what do you want from us? An apology? A promise to do better? What would make this right? I want you to actually see me. Not as the family documentarian or the one who handles things quietly or the daughter who doesn't need as much as Mandy. Just as me, as someone who deserves to be at the center of our family story sometimes, not always at the edges." Mandy stood up, crossing her arms. "You know what? I'm tired of being made to feel guilty for having a good relationship with Mom and Dad. I'm sorry you feel left out, but maybe that's partly on you. You moved across the country. You barely visit. You don't share your life with us. How are we supposed to include you when you keep yourself separate? I moved away because being here felt like drowning. And I keep myself separate because every time I try to be present, to be involved, I get relegated to the margins anyway. So why bother?" The argument continued, voices rising and falling. accusations and defenses piling up like debris. It wasn't the clean confrontation I'd imagined, where everyone had their moment of realization, and we all understood each other better. It was messy and painful and unresolved, exactly like real family conflict actually is. Eventually we reached a kind of exhausted standoff, everyone too drained to continue. Mom suggested we all sleep on it, talk more in the morning when emotions weren't so high. I agreed, grateful for the escape, and retreated to the guest room where my camera had been recording the entire exchange. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. The documentary was supposed to create understanding, but all it had done was create conflict. Maybe some things were better left unexamined, some patterns better left in place rather than exposed and challenged. But then I thought about Veronica and all the other people I'd interviewed, people who'd spent decades invisible in their own families. I thought about the footage I'd captured, the undeniable evidence of how families unconsciously organize themselves in ways that erase certain people. And I realized that even if my family never fully understood, even if this conversation changed nothing, the documentary still mattered. Because somewhere someone else would watch it and feel seen. Someone else would recognize their own family in those patterns, would feel less alone in their experience of being essential but unacknowledged. The work had value beyond my own healing, beyond my family's potential transformation. Morning came slowly, gray light filtering through the curtains. I could hear movement downstairs, the coffee maker, low voices. I packed my things methodically, preparing for whatever came next. When I went downstairs, I found Mom alone in the kitchen. She looked like she hadn't slept much either, her face puffy and tired. We didn't speak at first, just moved around each other in the familiar dance of morning routines. Then she said, without looking at me, I watched it again last night. After everyone left. The whole thing. And I saw things I hadn't noticed before. The way we gravitate toward Mandy, the way conversations flow around her and just past you. It's there. I won't say it's not there. I waited, letting her work through whatever she needed to say. I don't know if I can fix it, she continued. These patterns, they're so deep. I don't even know when they started or how to change them. But I see it now. You've made me see it. That's all I wanted, I said quietly. Not perfection, not immediate change. Just acknowledgement that it's real. She finally looked at me, and there were tears on her cheeks. I'm sorry, Natalie. I'm sorry you felt invisible in your own family. That was never what I wanted for you. I know, Mom. I know. We stood there in the morning light, the coffee maker hissing between us, and something shifted. Not everything, not enough to erase decades of patterns, but enough to suggest that maybe, possibly, things could be different. Not perfect, but different. Better. Dad came down eventually. Then Mandy and Derek arrived for the breakfast Mom had insisted on hosting. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone carefully avoiding the confrontation from the night before. But gradually, naturally, we started talking about the documentary itself, about the other people I'd interviewed, about how these patterns showed up in families everywhere. Mandy asked questions about my editing process, actually seemed interested in the technical aspects of how I'd structured the narrative. Dad wanted to know more about Veronica's story, whether she'd ever managed to change her family's dynamics. Mom kept trying to feed me, putting food on my plate, a peace offering in the form of scrambled eggs and toast. Before I left for the airport, Mandy pulled me aside. I'm not saying I agree with everything in your documentary. I still think you're partly responsible for the distance between us. But I get why you made it. And some of what you showed, yeah, I can see how that would feel excluding. Thanks for watching it, I said. I know it wasn't easy. Are you going to share it publicly? Like actually release it? That's the plan. The nonprofit is going to help with distribution, and we're submitting to some festivals. She nodded slowly. Okay, I guess I should prepare for people to recognize us. You could watch it with your friends, use it as a conversation starter about family dynamics. Maybe. Or maybe I'll just pretend I don't know the uptight sister who made a documentary about her family trauma. She said it with a slight smile, and I found myself smiling back. Not quite forgiveness, not quite understanding, but maybe the beginning of something more honest between us. The flight back to Portland felt different this time. Lighter somehow despite nothing being resolved. I'd done what I needed to do. Shown them what I'd seen. Created space for a conversation that might continue or might fade away like so many family promises to do better. But either way, the documentary existed. The pattern had been documented, made visible, turned into art that could reach beyond my own small story. And that felt like enough, or at least like a start. 3 months later, Dry Bread premiered at a small documentary festival in Seattle. I invited my family but didn't expect them to come. Mom and Dad surprised me by showing up, sitting in the back row, holding hands through the entire screening. Mandy sent a text. "Wish I could be there. Proud of you, sis." The audience response was overwhelming. During the Q&A afterward, person after person stood up to share their own stories of invisible labor, of being the family member who held everything together while everyone else got the spotlight. Some cried. Some laughed in recognition. All of them seemed grateful that someone had finally named what they'd been experiencing. A woman in her 60s approached me after, gripping my hands tightly. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for making me feel less crazy. I've been trying to explain this to my family for 40 years, and they've never understood. But seeing it laid out like this, it's exactly what I've been trying to say." I hugged her, this stranger who suddenly felt like family in a way my actual family sometimes didn't. And I realized that maybe this was the point of art, of documentary, of putting your pain into form and offering it to the world. Not to fix your own family necessarily, though maybe that too, but to create connection with other people who'd lived the same invisible experience, to build community through shared recognition of truths that usually stayed hidden. After the screening, Mom and Dad took me to dinner at a quiet restaurant overlooking Puget Sound. We didn't talk much about the documentary itself, but something had shifted in how they looked at me, how they listened when I spoke. I was no longer just their capable daughter who handled things quietly. I was an artist, a filmmaker, someone whose perspective had value beyond just being useful. The documentary went on to screen at a dozen more festivals over the next year. It won some awards, got written up in film magazines, and eventually was acquired by a streaming service that specialized in independent documentaries. Suddenly my inbox filled with messages from people around the world who'd watched it and seen their own families reflected in my story. The response was gratifying but also overwhelming. Each message was someone's pain, someone's years of feeling unseen, someone's hope that maybe naming the pattern would help change it. I tried to respond to as many as I could, but eventually had to accept that the documentary had taken on a life beyond my capacity to manage its impact. My relationship with my family continued to evolve slowly, messily, imperfectly. We talked more openly about dynamics that used to go unmentioned. Holidays became slightly less fraught, though the old patterns still reasserted themselves sometimes when we weren't paying attention. Mandy and I found a rhythm of communication that worked better than our previous attempts at forced closeness. But the real gift of making Dry Bread wasn't family reconciliation or professional success. It was learning that I could take the thing that had made me feel smallest, my invisibility in my own family, and transform it into something that made me visible to countless strangers. That I could use my skills as a documentarian, not just to preserve other people's stories, but to claim my own. That piece of dry bread, that moment of being served leftovers while everyone else feasted, had become the catalyst for something larger than I'd imagined. Not revenge, despite what the title suggested, but revelation. A way of holding up a mirror to family systems everywhere and saying, "Look at this. See what we do to each other, often without meaning to. See how love and harm can coexist. See how we can care deeply for people while also erasing them. And maybe, just maybe, if we can see it clearly enough, we can start to change it." A year after the premiere, I received an email from Veronica, the woman I'd interviewed in that Portland coffee shop. She'd watched the finished documentary and wanted me to know that she'd shown it to her family. They'd had their own difficult conversation, their own reckoning with patterns that had persisted for decades. Things weren't perfect, she wrote, but they were different. Better. And she thanked me for giving her the language and the framework to finally articulate what she'd been trying to say her whole life. I saved that email, printed it out and hung it on my wall next to film festival awards and professional accolades. Because ultimately that was what mattered most. Using my work to help people feel less alone, to create space for conversations that needed to happen, to document truths that usually stayed hidden because they were too painful or too familiar to examine closely. The dry bread had become something else entirely. Not just a symbol of my own exclusion, but a universal metaphor for how families unconsciously distribute care and attention, how some people get the feast while others get the scraps, How patterns perpetuate until someone finally holds up a camera and says, "Look, really look. This is what we've been doing." And in the looking, in the act of making invisible labor visible, something shifts. Maybe not everything. Maybe not immediately. But enough to suggest that transformation is possible. That families can learn to see their own members more clearly. That documentation itself can be a form of love, even when what it documents is painful. I kept making documentaries after Dry Bread, exploring other aspects of family dynamics, emotional labor, and the invisible work that holds communities together. But that first piece, born from a Thanksgiving dinner and a piece of dry bread that somehow captured everything, remained the most personal and the most important. Because it taught me that the moments when we feel most invisible might actually be the moments when we're seeing most clearly. And that clarity, documented and shared, can become a gift not just to ourselves but to everyone who's ever felt unseen in their own life, their own family, their own story. The camera doesn't lie. It just shows what's there. And sometimes what's there is exactly what needs to be seen, named, and finally changed. 2 years after Dry Bread premiered, I found myself back in Mapleton for Thanksgiving again. This time the invitation had come differently. Mandy had called me directly, not Mom acting as intermediary, and asked if I'd be willing to come home. Not demanded, not assumed, but asked. The difference mattered. I'd hesitated, old wounds still tender despite the time and distance. But something in her voice, a vulnerability I wasn't used to hearing from my always confident sister, made me say yes. The flight felt familiar now, this journey between my chosen life and my inherited one. I'd made it several times over the past 2 years for various occasions, each visit slightly less fraught than the last. We were learning, all of us, how to be family in a new way that acknowledged old hurts while trying not to be trapped by them. When I arrived at my parents' house, the first thing I noticed was different. There, on the photo wall in the living room, hung a new frame. Not the professional portrait of Mandy and Derek, though that was still there. This one was older, pulled from archives I thought had been forgotten. Me at 23, holding my first real camera, grinning with the unself-conscious joy of someone who just discovered their purpose. The frame was the same size as Mandy's, positioned at the same height. Equal. Mom appeared behind me, following my gaze. I found that in a box in the basement. Thought it deserved to be up here with everyone else. I turned to look at her, and she met my eyes with an expression that was part apology, part hope. "It's a good photo. You look happy." I was happy. "I know." She touched my arm briefly, then moved past me toward the kitchen, leaving me standing there with the weight of that small gesture settling in my chest. Dinner that night was different too. The table had been set with everyone's names on cards, mine included, positioned not at the end but in the middle between Dad and Mandy. The placement felt deliberate, intentional, like someone had actually thought about where I belonged, rather than just assuming I'd find whatever space was left over. Mandy had cooked again because that was her gift and her joy, but this time she'd asked beforehand what I wanted on the menu. Had actually listened when I mentioned I'd gone mostly vegetarian and made sure there were options beyond just side dishes. Small things, easy to overlook, but laden with meaning for those of us who'd learned to read family dynamics in gestures rather than words. Derek pulled out my chair when I approached the table, a courtesy I'd never received from him before. Dad asked about my recent projects with genuine interest, following up on details from previous conversations rather than treating each interaction like it was starting from zero. Mom made sure the breadbasket reached me first this time, still warm from the oven, rolls that were soft and buttery, and nothing like that piece of dry bread that had started everything. We ate and talked and laughed, and it wasn't perfect because families never are. Old patterns still tried to reassert themselves. Conversation still gravitated toward Mandy more than me. Attention still pooled in familiar places. But now when it happened, someone noticed. Mandy would redirect a question to me. Mom would ask for my opinion. Dad would make space in the conversation for my voice. They were trying. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely trying. And that trying mattered more than I'd expected it to. After dinner, as we cleared plates and packaged leftovers, Mandy cornered me in the kitchen. She was loading the dishwasher with the precise efficiency of someone who'd done this task 1,000 times, and I was wrapping pie slices in aluminum foil. "I've been thinking a lot about your documentary," she said without preamble. "About what you showed us." "Yeah. I watched it again a few months ago. The whole thing, not just our parts." And I saw myself in those other stories too. Not just as the one getting all the attention, but as someone who got trapped in a role just like you did. I stopped rapping, giving her my full attention. Everyone expected me to be the entertaining one, the social one, the one who made events special. And I performed that because it's what I got praised for, what made me valuable. But it was exhausting, Nat. Always being on, always having to make things perfect. I couldn't just show up and be normal because normal wasn't what they wanted from me. I'd never thought about it from that angle, how visibility could be its own kind of trap. You felt like you had to perform to keep their love. She nodded, her hands going still in the dishwasher. And you felt like you had to be invisible to prove you didn't need anything from them. We both got stuck in roles that hurt us, just in different ways. We stood there in the kitchen that had witnessed so many family moments, the sight of that Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything, and something passed between us. Not complete understanding because we'd lived different experiences even within the same family. But recognition that we'd both been shaped by systems neither of us had consciously chosen. I'm trying to be different with my friends now, Mandy continued. When they expect me to be the cruise director, to organize everything and make it magical, I'm learning to say I can't. That I need them to step up too. It's hard though. They look disappointed, like I'm letting them down. That's exactly how I felt for years. Like disappointing people was worse than disappearing. She closed the dishwasher and turned to face me fully. I'm sorry I didn't see it earlier. What you were going through. I was so focused on maintaining my role that I didn't notice you were barely in the picture. I'm sorry too. For making a documentary about our family without warning you first. For exposing things publicly that maybe should have stayed private. She considered this, then shook her head. No, it needed to be public. If you just told us privately, we probably would have denied it or minimized it. Seeing it documented, seeing it in the context of other families with the same patterns, that's what made it impossible to ignore. Mom appeared in the doorway, surveying the cleanup progress. You two need help? We're good, Mandy and I said simultaneously, then laughed at the synchronicity. Mom smiled, and in that smile I saw relief, hope, the complicated satisfaction of a mother watching her daughters finally find some kind of equilibrium. She disappeared back toward the living room, leaving us to finish the work together. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, I found myself alone in the living room with just the light from the corner lamp. I stood again in front of that photo wall, studying not just my own image but the entire collection. The arrangement told a story, like any good documentary. A family evolving through time, capturing moments of celebration and transition and ordinary life. My photo wasn't the biggest or the most prominent, but it was there, positioned with intention, claiming space on a wall that had once seemed too full to include me. And that felt like enough. Not victory, not vindication, but something quieter and more sustainable. Belonging. The next morning, I woke early and found Dad in the kitchen making his famous terrible coffee that everyone complained about, but he refused to change. He poured me a cup without asking, and we sat together at the table in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the backyard he'd meticulously maintained for 30 years. Your mother's been different since we saw your film, he said eventually. More aware of things. She asks me now if I feel seen, if I feel appreciated. Strange question from someone you've been married to for 40 years, but I think she needed to ask it. And do you? Feel seen? He thought about it, sipping his awful coffee. More now than I used to, yeah. Funny how you can live with people your whole life, and still miss important things about them. That's what the documentary was trying to show. How easy it is to miss things when you're not looking for them. Well, you made us look. Whether we wanted to or not. He said it without resentment, just stating a fact. I'd made them uncomfortable, forced them to examine things they'd have preferred to ignore. But sometimes discomfort was necessary for growth, for change, for becoming the family you wanted to be rather than the family you'd always been. I flew back to Portland that afternoon, and as the plane lifted off, I looked down at Ohio one more time. Somewhere in that landscape of bare trees and gray November sky was the house I'd grown up in, the family that had shaped me, the people who were learning to see me differently because I'd finally found a way to make myself visible. The documentary continued to reach people, screening in community centers and universities, being used in family therapy sessions and sociology classes. Each message I received from viewers reminded me why I'd made it, why putting private pain into public form mattered. Not everyone could make a documentary about their family, But everyone deserved to have their experience validated, their invisible labor recognized, their story told. And sometimes telling your story didn't fix everything, but it created space for something new to grow. New conversations, new awareness, new possibilities for how families could function if they were willing to look honestly at their own patterns. That piece of dry bread had become more than just a symbol of exclusion. It had become a catalyst for transformation. A reminder that even the smallest slights could reveal larger truths. That documentation itself could be an act of resistance against erasure. Years from now, when people ask me why I became a documentarian, I think about that Thanksgiving dinner, about scrolling through Facebook photos and feeling the shock of recognition that came from seeing your own invisibility captured in high definition. I think about the choice I'd made to document rather than simply endure, to create rather than just consume, to tell my truth even when it made people uncomfortable. And I'd remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is hold up a mirror to the people who love you and say, "This is what I see. This is what you've been doing. This is what needs to change." Not because you want to hurt them, but because you want to be seen by them. And being seen, truly seen, is worth the risk of everything falling apart. Because maybe it falls apart, or maybe, just maybe, it falls together in a new way that includes everyone at the table, not just the ones who've always had the warmest bread. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.